Now?
Yes.
Is that enough?
Yep.
What is culture? Culture is a set of values, beliefs, behaviors, and communication patterns shared by members of a group or a society. Culture forms over time and shifts over time, and it's one way that we define ourselves. It defines who we are and what we label as acceptable. Different cultural values and practices help us define who belongs in our group. But by defining who belongs, cultural differences can also be used to define who does not belong. Can I do it now?
Yes.
In many ways, culture is like an iceberg. When we see an iceberg, the portion visible above water is, in reality, only a small piece of a much larger whole. Similarly, people often think of culture as the numerous observable characteristics that we can see with our eyes, like food, dancing, music, art, or greeting rituals. The reality is that these are merely an external manifestation of deeper components, the complex, deeply held preferences and priorities known as attitudes and values.
Same thing.
Deep below the iceberg's waterline are a culture's core values. These are primarily learned ideas of what's good, right, desirable, and acceptable, as well as what is bad, wrong, undesirable, or unacceptable. In many cases, different cultural groups share the similar core values of honesty, or maybe respect or family, but these are interpreted differently in different situations and are incorporated in unique ways into specific attitudes applied in daily situations. I'm gonna wait for the reflection here to go off. Okay. So, why is it important to understand culture? Well, higher education is a culture. Consider, for example, the ways first-generation college students may feel out of place at a university. They don't know the language, the hierarchy, the unspoken and unwritten rules for behavior. First-generation college students, or even returning adult students, including many veterans, may feel like outsiders in higher ed. They may feel like they just don't belong. What differences do you notice between the core values of each branch? What similarities? For example, notice how multiple branches list honor or respect as a core value. Many cultures and individuals state that they value respect. But what does that look like? For example, is asking veterans to stand and be recognized a sign of respect? Well, some veterans may appreciate the recognition, but many others may not like being singled out or surprised in this way. Ready?
Yep.
For example, we demonstrate values like respect in observable behaviors, such as the words we use, the way we act, the laws we enact as societies, and even the ways we communicate with each other every day. Each branch of the U.S. military has its own set of core values. These values define not only how a service member behaves on active duty, but how they live, even in personal situations. Social scientists have identified cultural dimensions that help us understand how different cultural groups are similar and different. For example, the U.S. military is very hierarchical and collective, which is quite different from much of civilian, individualistic U.S. culture. Let's dig deeper into a few of these dimensions.
Then do you want to stop or you want to just keep going?
I'll just keep going. In high power distant cultures, status differences shape social interactions. Those with authority make decisions. High power distance is more hierarchical. Low power distance cultures don't spend much energy on status differences. Empowered decision making is expected across all levels. Low power distance groups are more of a flat type organization. The U.S. military is a high power distance culture. How does this show up? Well, if you think about visible behaviors, remember those things above the water in the iceberg image? You can see high power distance culture in, for example, the detailed uniform requirements in the military. Uniforms identify status, showcase pride, and preserve tradition. All uniforms have a public display of rank, which clearly identifies the wearer's place in the hierarchy. Wearing uniforms also ensures that all members of the group adhere to the same rules for clothing. Individualism and collectivism are other cultural values that impact the ways we behave. In a collectivist culture, the group comes first. In an individualistic culture, the emphasis is on individual rights and responsibilities rather than what is best for the group. What do you think? Is the military a more collective or individualistic culture? The military is much more collective. Members of the military are part of a cohesive or tight group. The goals of the group are placed ahead of one person's individual goals. Members of the group are very emotionally invested in their group or unit. They're very connected, and membership in the group is extremely important to their sense of self, their personal identity. Also, in the military, enlisted personnel cannot resign or quit without permission. Even at the end of their term of service, separation, the military term for resignation, requires permission and can be refused or postponed. In contrast, civilian culture in the U.S. is much more individualistic. The emphasis is on individual rights. For example, liberty and justice for all. Self-reliance in this kind of individualistic culture is often the goal. The United States military has a unique culture. In many ways, the culture of the U.S. military is very different from that of higher education. Just like first-generation college students may not feel like they belong in higher education, people with no military experience may feel like an outsider when it comes to military culture. The military style of communication is very direct and to the point. Why might this be? How might this be different than the style of communication expected in, say, a college paper? For example, might a military student struggle to expand and share more of their individual views? Probably.
Is that it?
Higher education often encourages students to try new things, to think outside the box and be creative. How might this attitude of embracing uncertainty compare to the realities of minimizing uncertainty during combat? Just one more quick thing. The U.S. military, like higher education, has a distinct culture that shapes behaviors, appearance, beliefs, and values. What cultural values do you see in these practices? When an individual has a choice about whether or not to relocate, is that a more individualistic culture? Why or why not?
Yep.
Like an iceberg, when it comes to culture, there are aspects of all cultures that we can see and describe easily. But there are also many deeply rooted ideas that we can only understand by analyzing those deeper values, studying our institutions, and, in many cases, reflecting on our own core values. Visible practices, remember, those above the waterline, may change rapidly, but the underlying values are usually slow to change. Military students have shared that they don't always feel like they belong. Culture can help us define where we belong, help us define our group, but it can also create unhelpful stereotypes or barriers between us, especially if we don't take the time to investigate, reflect on, and discuss the cultural differences we all have.